The sovereign's vigil stretched into years, not nights, an ever-lengthening echo of devotion that transcended the mortal coil. Philip II of Spain, he who once ruled with iron wisdom and courtly grace, had become a monarch suspended between realms, his mind tethered to a body that breathed no more. He haunted the corridors of the palace as a spectre himself, his footsteps a soft lament upon cold stone, each echo a refrain of a love that had slipped into rot and ruin. Candles, dozens upon dozens, flickered in grotesque defiance of death's permanence, their feeble flames casting skeletal shadows that danced along ornate walls carved with depictions of saints and martyrs who watched, horrified, the abominable worship of decay. He would sit in the twilight of that mausoleum chamber, holding his lost queen in his arms, whispering into lips that could no longer answer, weaving dreams of reconquest, of dynastic glory, of children yet unborn. His words were suffused with longing and irrevocable fate, spoken as though the dead were listening, as though her spirit still guided his imperial hand. Court business was conducted in a hush. Diplomats arrived, their faces etched with polite dread, handing him treaties in dueling languages. He signed them with a pen stained by tears he had wiped upon his sleeves. His gaze remained fixed upon the body on the bed, where he lay her lovingly, her wedding gown in tatters, petals crushed beneath her still form, a faint garden scent indistinguishable from the fetid perfume of decay, all enchanted in one unbearable breath. Of nights he made a symphony of mourning. He would cradle a skull, selected, polished from the royal charnel house, and place it before him at the throne, as though counsel sat in bone. "She commanded me so," he would murmur to envoys, his voice steady, devastating. "My soul must obey." The skull became a second confidant to her corpse, and in that unholy trinity he found solace. The crown upon his head was heavy, but the weight of the dead pressed in mightier still. The palace staff moved through corridors like shades, their eyes haunted by sleepless worry. Whisperers spoke of overheard conversations between king and corpse, diplomatic instructions, war plans, love songs he composed in a Baroque language of mourning. "We must march east," he'd say, "for her memory demands conquest." The men and women who heard such things could not speak, for to betray his devotion was to invite retribution as cold and fatal as his grief. Visions began to unfurl in that suffocating darkness. Sometimes he saw her hand twitch, slow and crimson, as though stirred by his touch. He recoiled, then laughed, a hollow, breaking sound. "Do you return to me?" he'd ask the silent air. Her form remained untouched by movement, but the flicker of candlelight warped the shadows until he believed her brow lifted, her eyes flickered. The illusion was his drug, and he drank deep of it, night after endless night. Meanwhile, across the kingdom, the tapestry of Spain's power remained intact, shockingly intact. Embassies reported swift, precise decisions, wars were concluded, alliances sealed. They spoke in hushed awe of how grief had made him implacable, unyielding as stone, sharper than steel. His heart had turned to obsidian, and he ruled with an unforgiving hand, a ruler both revered and feared. Yet all this emerged from the hush of a death chamber, where candles burned eternal. He began to commission works of art memorializing her. Busts carved in marble and gilded altarpieces depicting her in serene repose, all commissioned not for posterity but for proximity, to bring her presence into every hall, every chapel, every intimate corner of court life. His love became public spectacle. Hunts were held in her name. Masses said for her repose on every day of the calendar. Poets wrote her laments in measures that trembled with devotion, signed with his own trembling hand. At times, he would emerge from his chamber, hollow-eyed, robes stained with candle wax and tears, and appear before his council in silence, as if wreathed in the aura of a revenant. He spoke little, save to say, "I heed her counsel still," and left them to puzzle and fear the truth embedded in those words. The nights, however, were the most relentless. In one such vigil he pressed her to his side, one hand cradling her skull, the other resting on the cold hollow of her heart. He recited sonnets he had written, bold, terrible poems that named her death as the nexus of his will. He spoke of crossing oceans, of spreading her glory like contagion across the world. Each syllable was a crucible of sorrow, each vow a dirge. As years passed, the sense of decay softened, the tombstones of memory polishing themselves in candlelight and incense. The flesh gave way to wax, the warmth to a pale, immaculate rigidity, and the king took no notice. He had surrendered to an obsession that was neither life nor death, but movement between them, an interstice where neither could touch him, where he reigned supreme, tethered to absence. One morning, as dawn's pale fingers brushed the chamber, he knelt beside her, his body too tired to hold vigil, his voice thin. "At last," he mouthed, "I come." And there, in the wavering light, his shoulder sagged. Blood bubbled at his lips as though death finally claimed both hearts together. He collapsed into her arms, an eternal embrace, and the world outside paused, fell silent. When they found him, the candles guttering, the skull cracked beside him. He lay sprawled in rigid repose, his face pressed to hers as though to kiss her breath into eternity. In death, at last, they were together. His heart had failed, but the corpse he loved most remained untouched by time, preserved in the tragic grace of his devotion. Thus ended the reign of Philip II, the king who loved his wife so fiercely that death became their covenanted bond. His final decree written not in ink but in grief, etched forever in the silent, candlelit corridors of a kingdom built upon devotion turned to darkness. The silent corridors of the palace never recovered from the collapse of Philip II, nor did the hush that followed his fall. The sovereign and his long-dead queen lay together, finally reunited in that forsaken chamber where candles sputtered into embers and shadows recoiled from their king's stillness. Yet long after their final repose, their union haunted the architecture of grief, echoing through the vast halls in which life and death had entwined. As the dawn's pale wash crept over the marble floors, servants approached with trembling feet and pallid hearts, stepping into a scene that had become the fulcrum of their dread. Their sovereign lay as he had held her, close to her as though life's breath might yet stir between them, and they dared not disentangle that final embrace, for to do so would be to rend open the mystery that had encompassed the throne. They shrouded them both in silken cloths of deepest black, heavy enough to press out the last flicker of flame from within, and carried them together to the crypt beneath the chapel, where coffins waited, identical in all but the name upon the lacquered brass plate. The crypt, already cold before, turned spectral at their arrival, its walls steeped in incense and sorrow. The bearers placed both caskets upon a dais of stone, side by side, as though the death that once divided them could be reconciled in marble stillness. In the days that followed, rumors unfurled like black banners over the kingdom. It was said that those who glimpsed the tomb at dusk saw candles kindled from unseen hands, their light dancing like distant stars upon the faces of the monarch and his bride. A faint aura, cold and unmistakable, was said to press against the veil of the crypt door, as though the air itself remembered that final embrace. Courtiers whispered that the chamber where Philip's body lay, now vacated of flesh, had become a chamber of portent. They spoke of unnatural warmth that lingered upon the cold cushions where he had held his queen, of the scent of decayed petals and honeyed tears thickening in the air long after the candles had died. The faithful among the chaplains marked that the wax figure of devotion remained. Statues of Philip and his wife, carved in alabaster, now graced the crypt vault, sculpted by hands untainted by fear. The likenesses captured the sovereign's grave expression, the queen's serene repose, their carved fingers intertwined in marble permanence. The faithful came to kneel before these figures, laying offerings of wilted roses, of incense embers, of candles carved into their likeness, as though to coax some lingering spirit to stir. The hush of the crypt held its breath before these offerings, nodding in the hush of mourning made eternal. Beyond the crypt and chapel, the kingdom assembled itself anew, but the reign of Philip, even in death, continued to cast its shadow. Laws were enacted in his name, statutes of mourning, decrees demanding annual rites by candlelight in every village and city, masses of lamentation for sovereign and queen alike. The people, conditioned by years of whispered grief, entered these rituals in solemn procession, torches held aloft like broken stars, their eyes distant and hollow with remembrance. It won him immortality. His grief became civic devotion, his love transformed into ritual. But darker tales circulated in secret places. Travelers spoke of the night wind carrying soft strains of lament, songs of grief half heard by sleepers, whispered into ears with no visible voice. Shepherds in the mountains sheltered their flocks in terror when the moon was full, hearing the rustle of silk and the faint stirring of silk against stone, as though a bride and her bridegroom walked the corridors of night once more. In the border towns, children swore they saw flowers sprouting atop his empty throne in the palace, rooted in sorrow and bloom as though nourished by spectral tears. The years advanced, and the once lavish court that had bent to death's devotion crumbled into memory. Advisors who remained spoke only in ceremony of their late king, keeping his portrait veiled in black damask in the great hall. Envoys from distant lands, who had once bowed to the power of his mourning, now came with cautious reverence, their eyes avoiding the portraits, as though they might find death's reflection there. They carried with them treaties of peace, of rivalry cooled by the frost of remembrance. There were no more wars, only long shadows of grief sweeping across borders. Meanwhile the crypt endured. Over time, the candles flickered out and the statues dulled with dust and tears uncounted. But in the dark hours between days, those who dared to wander near spoke of distant breathing like the passing whisper of another world, of a chill that circled them though no door opened, of a faint presence that lingered in the hush of stone. The catacombs beneath the palace door throbbed with that same silence that had bound king and queen to each other, and perhaps, beyond them, to the land itself. Generations later, historians spoke of Philip II's final devotion as if it were a legend folded into the marrow of Spanish memory, a tale used to explain every inexplicable sorrow and every fragile peace. They called it the morning of the monarchy, a devotion so deep that it transcended law and faith, and anchored a kingdom in the cold embrace of loss. In that crypt, long after the hands that carved their statues were dust, sculpted figures still held each other in cut stone, a final testament to love that would not be contained by life or death. Pilgrims who came seeking penance or meaning pressed their hands to the marble, saying that the touch felt colder than marble ought to be, a cold not born of stone but of an absence still breathing. And so the story continued, not in voices, not in ink, but in cold hearts and quiet places, in ceremonies conducted by candlelight, in the hush that followed the flicker of every dying star and every extinguished flame. The king who loved his wife beyond the grave had become the kingdom's own corpse of memory, preserved not in flesh but in sorrow, carved not in life but in the endless dark embrace of legend. The marble figures of king and queen in the crypt patinated through the centuries, but their presence remained charged, alive with a memory that no stone could contain. In the era after Philip II's final repose, the palace rose and fell under successive reigns, but everywhere, grief hung like incense, subtle and relentless. It shaped rituals, secret prayers, and a quiet obsession with the boundary between love and death. All knew the morning of the monarchy was more than legend. It was a living tale. Generations passed, and the crypt's legend spread through low voices across taverns and cloisters, in marketplaces and dim-lit inns. Travelers told of sightings at midnight, when moonlight pooled upon the tombs and the alabaster figures, etched in grief and marble, seemed to shift in gesture. A pale hand might reach a little further, a head turn barely perceptible. Those who watched the spectacle felt a tremor in their hearts, as though the love that had bound the sovereign to his dead bride still existed in that hush between mortal and eternal. Pilgrimages began. Noblewomen, pale and secretive, made their way under cloak to the crypt at pilgrimage time, carrying wreaths of withered rose and boxes of perfumed oil. They knelt before the figures, pressing their foreheads to cold marble, beseeching the presence of sorrow to absolve a broken heart or bless a longing that would not yield to time. The air around them gathered fragility, as if softened by presence beyond mortal sense. Some claimed that in those moments their tears hardened upon the stone, mingling with centuries of grief, sealing their offerings in crystalline hush. Meanwhile, within the palace's living galleries, a strange duality developed. The court strove for renewal, commissioning tapestries of joyous hunts, vibrant coronations, gilded prosperity. But the hush of the crypt whispered through every thread. In the flicker of torchlight, the tapestry's colors darkened. Golden garments shimmered with something like mourning. Courtiers who had grown up hearing Philip's last vigil murmured that even in celebrations, a greater devotion persisted, an unseen tether to sorrow that resisted the passage of festivals. At twilight of a certain autumn, when leaves along the palace gardens turned the color of dried blood, the silence of the crypt stirred in a way that convulsed the realm. Aviary's birds hushed their calls, fountains' water slowed, and the air itself seemed to hesitate. Then the palace walls rang with the tolling of an unseen bell, a slow and deep sound that trembled through stone and soul alike. The mausoleum, silent for centuries, responded. Vaulting chambers caught the echo while outside courtiers staggered in hallways, senses unsettled by a summons from another realm. In the crypt, it was said, candles, long since melted to nothing, gleamed in phantom light beside the statues. The air thrummed with distant breaths, as though two presences, one living, one dead, shifted upon their dais. Shadows deepened, pooling like nighttime water, and shapes unraveled at the periphery of vision. The stone faces of king and queen, carved with grief eternal, seemed to breathe in sorrow's rhythm, to whisper of devotion that remained unbroken even by centuries. That same night, in the royal archives, old chronicles were discovered, hidden under boards long thought sealed. Fragments of Philip's final meditative writings, scrawled in trembling ink. They spoke not of war or ceremony but of a journey beyond grief, an urge to follow his queen into the realm of absence where time unraveled. Historians pored over the passages, piecing together a vision of love beyond flesh and blood, a devotion that bound king and queen in death and beyond, shaping the very soul of a nation. These writings changed the way posterity saw the mourning. Not only a madness, nor merely tragedy, but a devotion that defied the world's limitations. But as centuries unfolded, that devotion gathered specters. Visitors to the crypt reported scents of wilted florals that lingered beneath the stone floor, of breath upon the cheek though no sound intruded. Some claimed that children who slept too near the sealed crypt dreamed of being led through corridors of candlelight, of pale hands beckoning them toward marble faces that watched in loving silence. These were neither nightmares nor dreams but something at once both, haunting and sacred. In the wider world, the legend enveloped poets, scholars, and those who sought meaning in sorrow. Chronicles were written in hushed Latin, poems composed of long-lost vernaculars, each citing the mourning of the monarchy as an emblem of love's eternal refusal to yield to death. Bells tolled annually at twilight on the anniversary of Philip's passing. Across the land, masses of ivory smoke rose from every cathedral, drifting like silent hymns across fields and villages. Subjects lit candles at their windows, gazed into flame, and sought in the flicker the echo of a king's grief that had become their own. Scholars debated whether grief could be an act of sovereignty, that in loving beyond the grave, Philip had forged a bond between throne and spirit, enabling the crown to transcend the realm of flesh. These debates echoed through universities built centuries later, through dusty lectures, through cafes lit by gaslight where thinkers debated devotion's reach. The story of Philip and his queen became more than a courtly horror. It became a mystery of devotion, of the porous boundary between life and death, and a question whispered in hearts across centuries. Can love ever fully die? Generations later still, the crypt grew silent once more, sealed by time's wear. The marble statues grew veined with shadow. Dust settled in the folds of carved drapery. Yet the hush remained, a testament that no matter how the ages turned, the echo of their devotion endured. In that hush lay mystery, memory, and the ache of a love that refused finality. And in the stillness, across ages, the tale lived on in pilgrim's hymn, in scholar's quill, in child's dream, whispering that the king who loved beyond death wove sorrow and sovereignty into something eternal, something that outlived every spoken word and every fleeting flame. The crypt remained sealed in centuries of hush, and yet the memory of that final embrace, king and queen in their eternal repose, spoke anew through the ages in ways both subtle and profound, as though grief itself refused to yield even to time. In the world above, the palace transformed with the shifting centuries. New wings added, tapestries changed, the bloodline of rulers renewed and refashioned by alliances and conquest. Yet the hush that the sovereign's devotion once birthed remained like an ache embedded in the stones themselves. As centuries passed, the old palace fell into ruin and rebirth. Renaissance arches were grafted onto Gothic vaults. Baroque facades claimed to erase traces of sorrow behind gilded flourishes. But beneath every marble floor and behind every flicker of torchlight lay the residue of that final vigil, a silent insistence upon remembrance. Guardians of memory were found among the custodians of the crypt. A line of crypt keepers sworn to tend the dusty statues of marble, to keep the crypt sealed, to bear witness should shadows stir again. They moved through the catacombs with candle in hand, their breath steady, their steps echoing through arches lined with centuries of silence. The carvings in the crypt grew darker with age, the folds of marble draperies darker still, but always alive with depth. Their silence was a language. The slight tilt of the king's head, the poised stillness of the queen's hand, the interlocking of their fingers preserved in stone. Pilgrims came still, though the world knew them now as travelers seeking solace rather than courtly devotion, and left letters bound with ribbon, pressed into cracks of stone, their words asking for the quiet comfort of grief given voice by legend. In the centuries of steeples and enlightenment, writers, not historians alone, spun tales inspired by the mourning of the monarchy. Treatises on grief as sovereignty, poems of loss as power, ballads of marble immobility reviving devotion in their hearts. Philosophers in candlelit parlor studies debated whether love's persistence beyond death could serve as a moral exemplar or a cautionary ruin. They quoted lines from chronicles buried deep in archival vaults, fragments of Philip's meditative thoughts, proposing that his love had blasted open the borders between worlds, erecting a monument of memory stronger than ivy, deeper than bedrock. Occasionally, travelers dared to venture into the crypt at twilight, attuned to whispers that spoke of subtle signs. Could the marble breathe, or were the tears of granite softened by centuries of offerings? Folk who lingered at the threshold described a bereavement that pressed upon them, an ache in their chest, an echo of discordant longing born of love grown monstrously eternal. For a heartbeat they felt as though they, too, were participants in that final communion between flesh and stone. Meanwhile, in the world above, the crown moved on. New dynasties rose, declaring peace, waging wars for the sake of the living, seeking to forget the weight of sorrow that had once ruled a kingdom. Yet every coronation ceremony included a moment of silence, not out of command, but tradition. Lustral candles were lit, wreaths placed before a portrait of Philip's final vigil. Not of darkness, but of a love so vast that history could not fully define it. The people, unconsciously tethered to grief as if it had become inherited blood, recognized in those rituals the solemn heartbeat of mourning conjoined to power. In the hush of academies and Gothic libraries, scholars unearthed more of Philip's final writings. They turned brittle pages that spoke of a departure into shadow, of love's extension beyond the mortal veil. In those passages they found lines like an anatomy of devotion, grim, exalted, haunting, and realized that for Philip, grief had become a sovereign force. In life, a ruler able to bend nations. In death, a legend able to shape centuries. The crypt itself became the locus of mystery. Engineers and archaeologists, when archaeology was born, surveyed its walls with measured tools and hesitant reverence. They found the rock layer beneath the tomb unusually dense, the carvings so finely joined to the rock that they seemed to exude warmth amid cold stone. One measured temperature in that chamber and found it imperceptibly warmer than the outside corridors, as though breath still seeped from the marble itself. Those words entered journals, not for sensation, but for wonder. Science had met the memory of grief and found the uncanny. Generations later, as romantic poets painted in loneliness and medieval legends, the mourning of the monarchy was invoked as the darkest emblem of love. Haunted, beautiful, fatal. They spoke of love cavorting with death, of grief turned to legacy, of a sovereign's soul bound to stone and memory. In the salons of the 19th century, amid gaslight and mourning veils and composers who mourned through motifs of minor keys, Audiences listened as the story of Philip's devotion filled the air, not as horror, but as devotion beyond life's silence. The crypt gate was sealed then, barred by iron locks that bore inscriptions of mourning in Latin long faded to rust. Yet in nights when mist lay thick upon the palace grounds, or among ivy-covered ruins of newer wings, the seals seemed to hum. Locals spoke in cautious tones of the veil between life and death thinning on those nights, that the hush behind the metal barrier seemed to swell until it filled corridors, that if one placed an ear upon the cold gate, one could hear the softest rustle of breath, the ancient sigh of sorrow return to pulse. In modern times, historians and mystics alike convene at symposiums beneath vaulted ceilings, speaking of the mourning of the monarchy as a mystery, the sovereign's grief that had outlasted stone itself. They argue whether love that refuses death elevates devotion into the sacred or collapses it into ruin. Some say the crypt is haunted by the memory of that devotion, others by the memory of the sovereign's madness. But all agree that something lingers there, something beyond explanation. Thus the story endures, not in slabs of marble alone, nor only in brittle pages of history, but in the pulse between ceremony and silence, in the hush that follows remembrance. In every generation, when grief flares and memory demands ritual, the legend of the king who loved beyond death breathes anew, a silent testament inscribed in stone, in bloodless hands clasped forever, in the stillness that outlives the voice. The mourning of the monarchy remains alive, dynamic, spectral, eternal, persisting as the greatest of mysteries. That love, clinging beyond the bounds of life, transfigures sorrow into legend and grief into immortality.